In the spring of 2026, 3 black SUVs rolled into Pine Hollow, Mississippi, the kind of town where nothing ever really changed and everybody knew exactly who you were before you even said your name. The vehicles moved slow down the narrow road, tires crunching over gravel, engines low and expensive, drawing curtains aside and pulling people out onto porches. Pine Hollow had seen pickup trucks, church vans, and the occasional county car, but nothing like this. Not 3 of them. Not together. Not here. By the time they reached the town square, a crowd had already started to form. Word spreading the way it always did in places like this, faster than any phone call, faster than any headline. Someone said it was investors. Someone said it was politicians. Someone whispered it was something to do with that old woman who still lived out by the Carter place, the one with the porch light that never went off. A small stage had been set up near the courthouse steps, microphones wired, a couple of local news crews adjusting their cameras, sensing something bigger than a ribbon cutting or a charity check. And standing just off to the side of that stage was a woman in her late 60s, thin but upright, her grey hair pulled back, her hands trembling just slightly as she held onto the railing. Ruth Ellen Carter had lived in Pine Hollow her whole life, and in all those years, nobody had ever seen her look quite like this, like she was standing in the middle of a moment too big to hold, like the past and the present had collided all at once, and she wasn't sure where to put her feet. Behind her stood 3 men in tailored suits, each one different in build and bearing, but all of them carrying the same quiet intensity in their eyes, the kind that didn't come from money alone, the kind that came from something earned, something survived. The tallest of them stepped forward, his voice steady as he reached the microphone, the crowd settling into a silence that felt heavier than usual, like the air itself was waiting. 22 years ago, he began, pausing just long enough for every head to tilt, for every whisper to die. This town had a chance to make room for 3 boys. Only one woman did. He didn't look at the crowd when he said it, not right away. He turned instead, just slightly, his gaze finding Ruth, and something in his expression shifted. Something softer, something almost boyish beneath the man he had become. And everything that stands here today, he continued, his voice tightening just a fraction, started on her front porch. The camera lights flickered, people leaned in, confusion and curiosity mixing with something else, something harder to name. And before anyone could ask the question forming in their minds, before anyone could piece together how this quiet woman and these powerful men were connected, the story pulled back, like a breath taken before a long dive, and carried us 22 years into the past. Pine Hollow in 2004 was smaller than it looked on a map and larger than it felt in a person's chest. Population just over 3,000. One grocery store that closed early on Sundays, one gas station that doubled as a diner, and a church on every other corner, each one full on Sunday mornings and half empty the rest of the week. It was the kind of place where people didn't always say what they meant, but you could feel it anyway, in the pauses, in the looks that lasted a second too long, in the opportunities that never quite reached your door. Ruth Ellen Carter lived on the edge of town, in a house her mother had left her, a narrow wooden place with a wide front porch and a roof that had been patched more times than properly fixed. The boards creaking underfoot, the paint peeling in long, tired strips that told you exactly how long it had been since anyone had the money to make things new again. She was 47 years old that year, and if you asked anyone in Pine Hollow to describe her, they would have said she was kind, reliable, quiet, the kind of woman who showed up early and stayed late. The kind of woman who didn't cause trouble and didn't expect much in return. What they wouldn't have said, because most of them didn't know, was that Ruth had once planned a different life. One with laughter in more than one room, with a child's voice echoing down the hallway, with a future that felt like it was moving forward instead of circling in place. She had been engaged once, years before, to a man who talked about building a house just outside town, who drew up plans on scraps of paper and promised her they'd fill it with children. But plans have a way of shifting when life doesn't cooperate. And after 2 miscarriages that came too close together and cut too deep, something in that man changed. Something in both of them did. He left quietly, not with anger, but with absence, and Ruth was left in a house that had been meant for more than one person, trying to figure out how to live in all that extra space. She stopped talking about children after that, stopped letting herself linger in the aisles with baby clothes, stopped imagining what it would feel like to be called Mama. Instead, she poured herself into what she could hold on to. Mornings, she worked at the elementary school cafeteria, tying on an apron before sunrise, serving trays of eggs and toast to children who barely noticed her but always came back for seconds. Evenings and weekends, she cleaned the municipal building, mopping floors that reflected fluorescent lights and the quiet hum of a place that only felt important during the day. Her paycheck covered just enough to keep the lights on, the water running, and the mortgage from slipping too far behind. But not enough to fix the roof that had started leaking that past winter. Not enough to replace the aging car that coughed every time she turned the key. Not enough to build anything new. What she had, she stretched. What she didn't, she learned to live without. There was a rhythm to her days that made the loneliness manageable. A routine that filled the hours so they didn't echo too loudly. She woke before dawn, stepped out onto the porch with a cup of coffee, and checked on the small garden she kept in the yard. Tomatoes and collard greens, and whatever else would grow with enough care. She spoke softly to the plants sometimes, not because she believed they could answer, but because it felt better than silence. On Sundays, she sat in the 3rd pew at New Mercy Baptist Church, always the same spot, always the same quiet nod to Pastor Samuel Reed, who knew her well enough to see what most people missed. He had watched her with the children after service, the way she knelt to meet them at eye level, the way she listened fully, as if whatever they said mattered more than the clock, more than the next obligation waiting. "You ever think," he had said to her once, not long after that 2nd miscarriage, "that maybe the way you love is meant for more than you planned?" Ruth had smiled at him then, a small, tired smile that carried both gratitude and resignation. "Maybe," she said, "or maybe it's just meant to be given, whether there's a place for it or not." Most evenings, after the work was done and the dishes were washed, Ruth sat in her living room, the television on low more for the sound than the content, her eyes drifting often to the hallway that led to the 2 empty bedrooms she rarely entered anymore. Above her fireplace hung a simple wooden frame her mother had carved years ago, the edges worn smooth from time and touch. The words etched into it had become part of her, something she read so often she no longer needed to look up to see them. A home is where pain is given a place to rest. She had never been entirely sure what that meant when she first hung it there. She would come to understand it later in ways she could not have imagined. What Pine Hollow offered Ruth was familiarity, not necessarily belonging. There was no open hostility, no shouted slurs or burning crosses, nothing that would make the evening news, but there was a subtle distance, a line drawn not in words but in expectations. When she applied to assist in a classroom beyond the cafeteria, Despite having taken some college courses years back, the call never came. When decisions were made about hiring or promotions, her name rarely surfaced. She told herself she was fine with that she didn't need more than what she had, that peace could be found in consistency. But there were nights, lying in bed in a house too quiet for comfort, when she wondered what it would feel like to be chosen, to be someone's first call instead of a last option. Every night before she turned off the light, Ruth said a prayer, the same one, whispered into the stillness as if it might carry somewhere beyond the walls. "If there's still a child out there who needs a mother," she said, her voice steady, even when her heart wasn't, "let me not miss the knock." It had become less a request and more a ritual over the years, something she said because she always had, something she didn't expect to be answered anymore. She had learned, or thought she had, to make peace with the life she was given, to accept that some doors simply stayed closed no matter how gently you knocked. It was a Tuesday night in late October when the phone rang, the sound cutting through the quiet in a way that felt almost out of place. Ruth glanced at the clock, surprised anyone would be calling that late, and wiped her hands on a dish towel before picking up. "Hello," she said, her voice calm but curious. On the other end was a voice she hadn't heard in years, familiar but strained, like it had been carrying too much for too long. "Ruth, it's Marlene. Marlene Price, from the county office." Ruth straightened slightly, recognition settling in. They had gone to high school together, back before life had taken them in different directions. "Marlene," Ruth said, a small smile forming despite herself. "It's been a while. Everything all right?" There was a pause on the line, not the kind that comes from searching for words, but the kind that comes from deciding whether to say them at all. "I wouldn't be calling this late if it was," Marlene admitted, her voice lowering. "I've got a situation, and I don't have many options left. I thought of you." Ruth felt something shift in her chest, something she couldn't quite name yet, something that felt like the first drop of rain before a storm you didn't see coming. "What kind of situation?" she asked, moving slowly to sit down at the kitchen table, her free hand resting flat against the wall as if grounding herself. Marlene exhaled, the sound carrying through the line. "3 boys," she said. "Brothers, 15, 12, and 8. They lost their parents earlier this year. Car accident. They've been through 4 placements already, and it's not working. Families keep sending them back. They say the boys are too much, too angry, too shut down. If I can't find a place for them together by the end of the week, the system's going to split them up. Different counties, different homes." Ruth closed her eyes for a moment, the image forming whether she wanted it to or not. 3 children standing in separate rooms, looking for each other and not finding what they needed. "Why haven't their relatives stepped in?" she asked quietly. Another pause, heavier this time. "There's family," Marlene said carefully, "but it's complicated. Legal things, distance, and to be honest, they haven't exactly been eager. I can't get into all of it over the phone, but right now, these boys don't have anyone willing to take all 3. Not for real, not past a week or 2. Ruth's gaze drifted to the hallway again, to the doors she kept closed, to the space that had waited so long, it had almost stopped asking. "And you thought of me," she said, not as a question, but as a realization. "I did," Marlene replied, and there was something in her voice now, something like hope mixed with desperation. "I remember you, Ruth, the way you were with kids, even back then, the way you didn't look away when things got hard. I know your situation isn't easy. I know your house isn't perfect, but these boys don't need perfect right now. They need someone who won't quit on them the first time things get messy. Ruth swallowed, her mind racing through numbers, through realities, through the list of reasons this didn't make sense. The leaking roof, the limited income, the fact that she had spent years convincing herself she had learned to live without what was being placed in front of her now. "What are they like?" she asked, her voice softer, steadier than she felt. Marlene didn't sugarcoat it. "The oldest, Elijah, he doesn't trust anybody. He's been acting like the parent for years. The middle one, Micah, he's angry, fights at school, pushes back at authority. And the youngest, Noah, he hasn't really spoken in weeks. Not since the accident. He writes a little, draws sometimes, but he doesn't talk. Not to adults." Silence settled between them, thick and heavy, filled with everything Ruth was thinking and everything she was trying not to. She looked around her kitchen, at the peeling linoleum, the sink that dripped if you didn't tighten it just right, the chair across from her that had been empty for longer than she cared to count. "I need to think," she said finally, the words coming out slower than usual. "I can't just say yes without. I need to be sure I'm not taking on more than I can handle." "I understand," Marlene said quickly. "I wouldn't ask if I had another option. Take the night. But Ruth, if you say no, I'm out of time." The line went quiet after that, the call ending with no pressure, no promise, just the weight of a decision that refused to sit lightly. That night, Ruth didn't turn on the television. She sat at the kitchen table long after the dishes were done, her hands folded, her eyes fixed on nothing in particular as her thoughts moved in circles. She thought about the boys, about the way Marlene had described them, not as problems, but as pieces that had been broken too many times. She thought about her house, about what it could and couldn't hold, about whether love was enough when money wasn't, about whether showing up mattered if you couldn't fix everything else. She thought about the nights she had prayed for a child, the years she had told herself to let that go, the quiet she had finally learned to live with. And underneath all of that, she felt something else, something she hadn't felt in a long time, something that scared her almost as much as it called to her. She didn't sleep much. When she did, it was shallow, broken by dreams she couldn't fully remember, but couldn't shake either. Before dawn, she found herself on the front porch, the sky just beginning to lighten, the world in that in-between state where everything feels possible and nothing is certain. She wrapped her sweater tighter around herself and looked out over the yard, the garden still damp from the night air, the road beyond it empty and quiet. "If there's still a child out there who needs a mother," she whispered again, the words familiar but heavier now, "let me not miss the knock." This time, when she said it, it didn't feel like a ritual. It felt like an answer, waiting for her to accept it. When she went back inside, the phone was still where she had left it on the counter, silent, but somehow expectant. Ruth stood there for a long moment, her hand hovering just above it, as if once she picked it up, there would be no going back to the life she had carefully built around absence. She thought about the roof, about the bills, about the fear of failing not just herself, but 3 children who had already been failed too many times. And then she thought about something else, something simpler and harder to ignore. 3 brothers being told they couldn't stay together because nobody wanted all of them at once. Her hand closed around the receiver before she could talk herself out of it. Marlene answered on the second ring, her voice tight with anticipation. "Ruth?" "Bring them together," Ruth said, the words steady now, rooted in something deeper than certainty, something that didn't require everything to be perfect, to be real. She paused just long enough to make sure she was heard, to make sure she was choosing this fully. Or don't bring them at all. There was a silence on the other end, and then a breath that sounded like relief, breaking through weeks of tension. "Friday," Marlene said. "I'll bring them Friday." Ruth nodded, even though she knew Marlene couldn't see her. "I'll be here," she replied. She hung up the phone and stood there in the quiet kitchen. The same kitchen she had stood in the night before, but everything about it felt different now, like the walls had shifted just slightly to make room for something that hadn't been there before. She looked down the hallway again, at the doors she had kept closed, and for the first time in years, she walked toward them, her steps slow but certain. The life she had learned to accept was still there, still real, but it was no longer the only one in front of her. Something was coming. Something that would test every part of her. Something that would ask more than she had ever been asked to give. And still, she didn't turn away. Friday was coming, and with it, 3 boys who had nowhere left to go. Friday came slower than Ruth expected, and faster than she was ready for. The kind of day that carried weight from the moment the sun rose, like the air itself, knew something was about to change. She woke before dawn, not because she needed to, but because sleep had stopped coming easily once the decision had been made. The house felt different that morning, not larger or smaller, but fuller somehow, like it was holding its breath alongside her. She moved through her routine with careful intention, straightening things that didn't really need straightening, wiping down counters already clean, opening the windows to let in the cool Mississippi air, as if freshness alone could make the space more welcoming, more ready for what was coming. She paused outside the 2 bedrooms she hadn't used in years, her hand resting lightly on the doorframe before she pushed one open. Dust had settled in the quiet, thin layers that told the story of time passing without interruption. She stepped inside slowly, looking around as if seeing it for the first time. The empty bed, the dresser with nothing in it, the faint outline on the wall where something once hung and had been taken down long ago. "All right," she murmured under her breath, not to the room, but to herself, as if saying it out loud might steady her. She pulled open the windows, letting sunlight fall across the floor, then went back for clean sheets, shaking them out with a kind of determination that had less to do with fabric and more to do with purpose. By the time she finished both rooms, the house no longer felt like a place waiting for something lost. It felt like a place preparing for something new. By late afternoon, the sky had turned that soft gray that settles over Pine Hollow in the fall, the kind that made the world feel quieter than usual. Ruth stood on the porch, wiping her hands on her apron again, even though there was nothing left to wipe, her eyes drifting down the road every few seconds, listening for the sound she knew would come. When she finally heard it, the low hum of an engine approaching, her chest tightened in a way that surprised her. Not fear exactly, but something close to it, something that came from knowing there was no turning back now. The county vehicle pulled into the yard slowly, tires pressing into the dirt, and for a moment, everything seemed to still. Marlene stepped out first, her expression a mix of relief and apology, like she was grateful and sorry all at once. She turned toward the back door of the van, opened it, and stepped aside. The first boy out was Elijah, taller than Ruth had imagined, his shoulders already carrying more weight than a 15-year-old should have to hold, his jaw set tight, eyes scanning everything in front of him, not with curiosity, but with calculation. He didn't look at Ruth right away, not directly. He looked at the house, the yard, the road behind him, the distance to the trees, the kind of quick, practiced assessment of someone who had learned that safety was something you had to map out for yourself. Micah came next, Stepping down with less caution, but more tension, his body coiled like a spring that didn't know when it might be released. There was a bruise fading along the edge of his cheekbone, yellowing at the edges. Not fresh, but not old either. The kind of mark that didn't need explanation, because it had probably been earned more than once. His eyes moved differently than Elijah's, not scanning for exits, but locking onto things as if daring them to be a problem, as if waiting for something to go wrong so he could meet it head on. Noah came last, slower, smaller than Ruth expected, one hand gripping the strap of a worn backpack, the other holding a thin, weathered notebook pressed tight against his chest. He didn't look up at first, his gaze fixed somewhere near the ground, like eye contact was something he had decided to avoid altogether. When he did glance up, just for a second, his eyes were clear and distant at the same time, like he was present but not entirely reachable. For a moment, nobody moved. Marlene shifted her weight slightly, glancing between Ruth and the boys, waiting for something to break the stillness. Ruth stepped off the porch then, not rushing, not hesitating either, her movements calm and deliberate as she walked toward them. She didn't stay above them, didn't call them forward, didn't keep the distance that had probably been there in every other place they'd been taken. Instead, she walked right up, close enough to see the details, the lines in Elijah's face that shouldn't have been there yet, the tightness in Micah's hands, the way Noah's fingers curled around that notebook, like it was the only thing he trusted to stay. She stopped a few feet away, then did something none of them were expecting. She lowered herself down, bending at the knees until she was level with Noah, not because he was the youngest, but because he was the one least likely to meet her where she stood. "Hey," she said softly, her voice steady, not overly gentle, not overly bright, just real. "I'm Ruth." She let that sit for a second, not rushing to fill the silence. "I don't know what you've been told before," she continued, glancing briefly at Elijah and Micah before returning her focus to Noah. "So I'm not going to make you a bunch of promises I might not be able to keep." Elijah's eyes flickered at that, just slightly, something shifting behind the guarded look. "But I can tell you this," Ruth went on, her tone firming just a touch. "There's food inside, and you don't have to earn it, and nobody's sending you anywhere tonight." Micah let out a small, skeptical breath, almost a scoff, but he didn't say anything. Elijah finally looked at her directly, really looked, like he was trying to decide if what she was saying had any weight to it. Noah didn't speak, didn't nod, didn't react in any visible way, but his grip on the notebook loosened just enough to be noticed. Marlene stepped forward then, clearing her throat softly. "Ruth, these are Elijah, Micah, and Noah Brooks," she said, as if the introduction made any of this more formal, more structured. "Boys, this is Ms. Carter." Ruth shook her head slightly, not taking her eyes off them. "You can call me Ruth," she said. Then after a small pause, "Or nothing at all for now. We'll figure it out." It wasn't what they were used to hearing. It wasn't ma'am. It wasn't foster mother. It wasn't a role being imposed on them before they had a chance to breathe. She stood back up slowly, her knees protesting just a little, and gestured toward the house. "Come on in," she said. "Dinner's ready." There was no speech, no tour, no attempt to sell the place as something it wasn't. Just an open door and a simple statement. Inside, the house smelled like roasted chicken and seasoned greens, something warm and steady that filled the space in a way words couldn't. The boys stepped in cautiously, their eyes moving over everything. The worn furniture, the clean but aging walls, the small details that told them more than any explanation could. Elijah lingered near the doorway for a second longer than the others, like he was making a mental note of the threshold, then stepped fully inside, closing the distance on his own terms. They sat at the kitchen table without being told, instinct guiding them more than comfort, each one choosing a seat that gave them the best view of the room. Ruth moved quietly, placing plates in front of them, not piling food high, not making a show of it, just enough to be real. "Eat while it's hot," she said, taking her own seat last. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Micah reached first, grabbing his fork and digging in like the food might disappear if he didn't act quickly. Elijah followed, slower but just as intent, his eyes flicking up occasionally, watching Ruth between bites. Noah didn't eat right away. He sat there, looking at the plate, then at the table, then at the wall behind Ruth, as if the act of eating required a decision he hadn't made yet. "You don't have to talk," Ruth said gently, noticing without staring. "But you do have to take care of yourself. That includes eating." She didn't push the plate closer, didn't insist. She just let the words sit there. After a few seconds, Noah picked up his fork, his movements careful, almost hesitant, and took a small bite. It wasn't much, but it was something. Ruth didn't smile, didn't comment, didn't turn it into a moment bigger than it needed to be. She just nodded once, almost to herself, and kept eating. That first night passed without anything dramatic, which in its own way was the most unusual part. No yelling, no confrontation, no forced bonding, just quiet, careful coexistence. When it was time to sleep, Ruth showed them the rooms she had prepared. One for Elijah, one shared for Micah and Noah, explaining where things were in simple terms, not overwhelming them with rules. "Bathrooms down the hall," she said. "If you wake up and need something, my room's at the end. You don't have to knock." Elijah raised an eyebrow slightly at that, like he wasn't sure what to do with the idea of an open door. "I'll knock," he said, his voice low, controlled. Ruth inclined her head. "All right," she replied. "You knock." The days that followed didn't unfold like a storybook transformation. They were uneven, tense in places, quiet in others, filled with small moments that didn't look like much from the outside, but carried weight inside the house. Elijah tested boundaries without announcing it, staying out longer than he said he would, watching to see how Ruth would respond. The first time he came back late, the porch light was still on, and Ruth was sitting in the chair by the door, a plate covered with foil resting on her lap. She didn't stand up when he approached, didn't raise her voice. "You're late," she said simply. Elijah braced himself, shoulders tightening. "Yeah," he replied, waiting for the rest. "Food's still warm," she added, lifting the foil slightly. "You can tell me where you were tomorrow. Tonight you're eating." He frowned, confusion flickering across his face. "That's it?" he asked, suspicion clear. Ruth looked at him for a long second. "That's it for tonight," she said. "We've got time for the rest." It wasn't what he expected. It wasn't punishment, and it wasn't dismissal either. It was something steadier, something that didn't rise and fall with his behavior. He took the plate. Micah's anger surfaced faster, louder. A week into school, the principal called. "We've had an incident," she said, her voice tight with frustration. Micah got into a fight. Again. Ruth drove over without hesitation, walking into the office where Micah sat, arms crossed, jaw clenched, refusing to look at anyone. "You want to tell me what happened?" she asked, pulling a chair beside him instead of standing over him. "He started it," Micah muttered. "He said—" He trailed off, shaking his head. Ruth didn't push for the words. "And what did you do?" she asked instead. "I finished it," he snapped, anger flaring. The principal cleared her throat. "This kind of behavior can't continue," she said. Ruth nodded slowly. "I agree," she replied, "but I'm also wondering if anyone here asked why it keeps happening, or if we're just counting how many times." The room went quiet. The principal hesitated, then shifted in her seat. "That's not the point," she said. Ruth met her gaze, calm but firm. "It is, if you want it to stop," she answered. That weekend, Ruth drove Micah to a small gym on the edge of town, one of those places that smelled like sweat and effort, where a handful of kids were hitting heavy bags under the watch of a man who looked like he'd seen more than he said. "You've got energy," Ruth told Micah as they stood just inside the door. "You can let it burn you up, or you can learn how to use it." Micah looked at her, skeptical but curious. "You signing me up for something?" he asked. "I'm giving you a place to put it," she replied. "What you do with it is up to you." He didn't thank her, didn't smile, but he stayed, and that was enough. Noah remained the quiet center of it all, moving through the house like a shadow that never quite disappeared. Ruth didn't force conversation, didn't sit him down and demand words that weren't ready to come. Instead, she found ways to be present without pressure. At night, she sat on the edge of his bed and read aloud, not asking if he wanted her to, just starting with a story and letting him decide if he would listen. His eyes followed the pages, his breathing steady, his fingers sometimes tracing the edge of that notebook. Weeks passed like that, small increments of trust, building in places that didn't show on the surface. The turning point came on a night when Pine Hollow was hit by a sudden cold front, the temperature dropping faster than anyone expected, wind rattling the windows hard enough to make the house groan. The power went out just after midnight, plunging everything into darkness. Ruth gathered blankets, calling the boys into the living room, her voice steady despite the situation. "We'll stay in here," she said. "Closer together, keep the warmth in." Elijah moved first, helping Micah pull extra blankets from the hallway, their coordination almost automatic. Noah sat close to Ruth, his small frame tucked into the side of the couch, his fingers tight around his notebook. As the night wore on, the cold crept in slowly, persistent, settling into the bones of the house. Then Noah started coughing, at first light, then deeper, sharper, his body shivering in a way that didn't match the room. Ruth leaned in, pressing her hand to his forehead, her expression shifting instantly. "Hey," she said softly, her voice low but urgent. "Stay with me." Elijah looked up, alarm cutting through his usual control. "What's wrong?" he asked. Ruth didn't hesitate. "He's not okay," she said. "I need to get him to a doctor." "In this?" Micah shot back, gesturing toward the dark windows, the wind still howling outside. Ruth met his eyes. "Yes, in this." There was no car that would start reliably in that cold. No phone line to call for help. The nearest neighbor with a working truck was a quarter-mile down the road. Ruth wrapped Noah in blankets, then looked at Elijah and Micah. "I need you to stay here," she said, her voice firm. "Keep the fire going. Keep each other warm. I'm going to get help." Elijah shook his head immediately. "I'm coming with you," he insisted. "No," Ruth replied, sharper than before. "I need you here. They need you here." For a split second, something in his expression broke, the weight of being needed landing differently this time. He nodded, reluctantly. Ruth stepped out into the night, the cold hitting her like a wall, the wind biting through her coat as she moved forward one step at a time, the ground slick beneath her feet. She didn't think about the distance, didn't think about the risk. She thought about a small boy on her couch who had just started to trust her, who had just started to come back to the world. She walked, slipped once, caught herself, kept going, her breath visible in the air, her hands going numb, but she didn't stop. When she reached Lorraine Benson's house, she pounded on the door until it opened, her knuckles red, her voice steady despite everything. "I need your truck," she said. "It's Noah." Lorraine didn't ask questions. She grabbed her keys. They made it to the clinic in time. The doctor later said it was a combination of the cold and an underlying infection, something that could have turned serious if they had waited. Ruth sat beside Noah's bed as he slept, her hand resting lightly on his arm, her eyes heavy but alert. Elijah and Micah sat on the other side, closer than they had ever been to her, without pulling away. It was nearly dawn when Noah stirred, his eyes opening slowly, unfocused at first, then finding Ruth. For a moment, he just looked at her, really looked, as if seeing something clearly for the first time. Then his voice, small and rough from disuse, broke the silence. "You came back," he whispered. The room went still. Ruth's breath caught, but she didn't move, didn't overwhelm the moment. "Of course I did," she replied softly. "Where else would I go?" Noah blinked, his grip tightening slightly on her sleeve. "You'll be here in the morning?" he asked, the question carrying more weight than the words alone could hold. Ruth leaned closer, her voice steady, anchored. "I'll be here in the morning," she said, "and the next one, and the next one after that." Something shifted then, not all at once, not in a way that fixed everything, but in a way that mattered. Elijah didn't look away. Micah didn't pull back. And Noah, for the first time since he had walked into that house, didn't seem like he was preparing to disappear. The months that followed that night didn't transform everything at once, but they changed enough to matter, enough to make the house feel less like a temporary stop and more like something the boys could lean into without bracing for the fall. The porch light stayed on every evening, not as a signal anymore, but as a quiet habit Ruth had fallen into, a small, steady glow that greeted them whether they came home early or late, whether they were ready to talk or not. Inside, the rhythm of the house settled into something recognizable. Meals at the same time, school in the morning, the low hum of the television at night, Ruth's voice reading stories long after Noah had stopped pretending not to listen. Elijah began to come home earlier, not all at once, not without testing the edges a few more times, but the distance he kept started to shrink in ways that showed up in small moments, sitting at the table a little longer after dinner, asking a question about homework instead of figuring it out alone, lingering in the doorway of Ruth's room once before knocking instead of just passing by. He still watched everything, still carried himself like someone who expected things to go wrong, but there were cracks in that armor now, places where trust had started to take hold, whether he meant for it to or not. Micah threw himself into the gym with a kind of intensity that scared people at first, his punches sharp and relentless, his focus absolute. The man who ran the place, Coach Daniels, saw through it quickly. "You're not fighting them," he told Micah one afternoon, stepping between him and the bag. "You're fighting something else. Figure out what that is before it eats you." Micah didn't answer, but he came back the next day, and the next, and slowly, the anger that had once spilled over into everything began to find shape, to become something he could control instead of something that controlled him. He still got into trouble sometimes, still snapped when pushed too far, but now there was a place he could go, a way to come back from it. Noah changed the quietest, which made it the hardest to notice unless you were paying close attention. His words came slowly at first, one here, one there, always when he felt safe enough to risk them. He still wrote more than he spoke, filling pages in that worn notebook with stories that blended memory and imagination. Knights who lost everything and found it again. Kingdoms that fell and were rebuilt. Heroes who didn't always look like heroes at the start. Ruth never asked to read them, never reached for the notebook unless Noah handed it to her himself. And when he did, she read every word like it mattered, because it did. 18 months passed like that, not perfectly, not without setbacks, but with a kind of steady progress that felt real. The house held more sound now, laughter that came unexpectedly, arguments that didn't end in silence, footsteps that moved with familiarity instead of caution. Ruth filed the paperwork to begin the process of making it official, of turning what they had into something recognized beyond the walls of that home. It was slow, complicated, filled with forms and visits and questions that reduced their life together to checkboxes and signatures, but it was moving forward, and that was enough. There were moments, quiet ones, where everything felt almost complete. One Sunday evening after dinner, they sat on the porch as the sun dipped low, the sky stretching out in shades of gold and soft blue. Elijah was helping Ruth shell peas into a bowl, his movements easy, practiced, like it was something he had done all his life. Micah leaned back in his chair, tossing a tennis ball into the air and catching it again. The tension that used to live in his shoulders replaced, at least for that moment, with something like peace. Noah sat cross-legged on the steps, reading aloud from his notebook, his voice still soft but steady, the words clear as he worked through them. Ruth listened to all of it, the sound of their voices, the rhythm of their presence, and for a moment she allowed herself to feel something she had been careful with for a long time, something close to certainty. "Mama Ruth," Elijah said suddenly, the words coming out almost casually, like he hadn't spent days deciding whether to say them. Ruth's hands stilled in her lap, the peas forgotten for a second as she looked at him, her expression softening in a way she couldn't quite hide. "Yeah," she replied, her voice steady, despite the way her heart had shifted at the name. Elijah shrugged slightly, not meeting her eyes. "Just thank you," he said, the words simple, but carrying everything he didn't say. Ruth nodded, swallowing the emotion that rose up, choosing not to make it bigger than he was ready for. "You're welcome," she said quietly. That was all. That was enough. What none of them saw, what none of them could have known in that moment, was that somewhere far beyond Pine Hollow, in offices that didn't smell like collard greens and wood polish, in rooms where decisions were made with signatures instead of conversations, their names had begun to surface again. It started quietly, a file reopened, a question asked by someone who had never stopped carrying a different kind of silence. Charles Whitmore had spent years building a life defined by control, by order, by the belief that if something didn't fit the structure he understood, it didn't belong. His daughter had broken that structure years ago when she chose a life he didn't approve of, a marriage he refused to accept, a path that led her away from everything he had built. When she died, the distance between them didn't close. It hardened into something else, something unresolved, something that didn't leave him even as time passed. For months after the accident, he had kept his distance from the situation entirely, leaving it to lawyers and intermediaries, unwilling to confront the reality of what had been lost or what remained. But time has a way of forcing questions into spaces we try to keep closed, and eventually those questions found him. Where were his grandchildren? Who had taken them in? What kind of life were they living now? The answers came slowly at first, filtered through reports and summaries that reduced 3 lives to bullet points and assessments, multiple placements, behavioral concerns, no stable long-term home. Something in that report unsettled him, though he wouldn't have called it that. It wasn't guilt, not in the way most people would recognize it. It was something closer to disruption, the idea that something connected to him existed outside the structure he understood, outside his control. Find them, he instructed, his voice calm, measured, the way it always was when he made decisions that changed other people's lives. And so they did. By the time the investigation reached Pine Hollow, by the time the name Ruth Ellen Carter was written down in a report and placed in front of him, the boys had already begun to build something that felt like it could last. They didn't know that their past had caught up to them, that the family they had been told didn't want them had finally decided to claim them, not out of warmth, but out of something far more complicated. The first sign came in the form of a car that didn't belong. It appeared at the edge of Ruth's street one afternoon, parked just far enough away to avoid attention, but close enough to watch. Elijah noticed it first, his instincts still sharp, still tuned to anything out of place. "That car's been there before," he said quietly to Micah as they walked home from school. Micah glanced over, narrowing his eyes. "Probably just someone lost," he muttered, but there was a flicker of unease in his tone. Noah said nothing, but he looked at it too, his gaze lingering a second longer than usual. The car came back the next day, and the day after that. Always the same spot, always the same distance, always gone before anyone could approach it directly. Ruth noticed eventually. Of course she did. "You see something like that again, you tell me," she said one evening, her voice calm but firm. Elijah nodded. "I will," he replied, though something in his expression suggested he already had more questions than answers. The answers came sooner than any of them were ready for. It was a Friday afternoon when the second car arrived. This one not parked at a distance, not observing from the edge, but pulling directly into Ruth's yard with a kind of quiet authority that didn't ask permission. Ruth stepped out onto the porch as the engine cut off, wiping her hands on a towel, out of habit more than necessity. The door opened, and a man stepped out who looked like he belonged somewhere else entirely. His suit crisp, his posture straight, his presence controlled in a way that suggested he was used to being listened to. Charles Whitmore took a moment to look at the house, at the porch, at the yard, his eyes taking in every detail without comment, assessing rather than judging, though the difference between the two was thin. Behind him, another man stepped out, younger, carrying a briefcase, his expression neutral, professional. Ruth didn't step back. She didn't step forward either. She stood where she was, meeting him where he had chosen to arrive. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice even. Charles looked at her then, directly, his gaze sharp but not unkind, simply precise. "You must be Ruth Carter," he said. It wasn't a question. "That's right," she replied. He inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the confirmation. "My name is Charles Whitmore," he said, "and I believe you've been caring for my grandchildren." The words landed with a weight that shifted the air between them instantly. For a second, Ruth didn't respond, not because she didn't understand, but because she understood too quickly. "Elijah, Micah, and Noah Brooks," he continued, his tone measured, factual. "They are my daughter's children." The screen door creaked softly behind Ruth. She didn't need to turn to know they were there. She could feel it, the sudden stillness, the way the house had gone quiet, in a way it hadn't been in months. Elijah stepped forward first, his presence filling the doorway, his eyes locking onto the man in the yard with a recognition that came from memory more than familiarity. "You," he said, the word tight, controlled, carrying years of absence inside. "You're the one she wrote to." Charles's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind it, something small and quickly contained. "Yes," he said, "I am." Micah moved to stand beside Elijah, his body already tense, ready, while Noah hovered just behind them, his fingers tightening around the edge of the door frame. His eyes fixed on Charles, with a mixture of confusion and something deeper, something harder to name. Ruth stepped slightly to the side then, not moving away from the moment, but making space for what was unfolding. "What is it you want?" she asked, her voice steady, though her grip on the towel in her hand tightened just slightly. Charles clasped his hands in front of him, the gesture composed, controlled. "I want to take my grandchildren home," he said. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten. He simply stated it, as if it were the most natural conclusion in the world, as if everything that had happened in the past 18 months was a temporary arrangement waiting to be corrected. Behind him, the man with the briefcase stepped forward just slightly, opening it with practiced efficiency. Elijah's jaw tightened. "This is our home," he said, his voice low but firm. Charles looked at him, not dismissive, not confrontational, but distant, in a way that suggested he was looking past the statement rather than engaging with it. "You've been staying here," he replied. "That is not the same thing." Micah took a step forward, anger rising fast. "We're not going anywhere with you," he snapped. "You didn't want us before. You don't get to show up now. And..." "Micah," Ruth said quietly, her voice cutting through just enough to stop him without shutting him down. He fell silent, but the anger didn't leave. It just waited. Charles shifted his attention back to Ruth. "I'm not here to argue," he said. "My attorneys will handle the legal aspects. I wanted to see the situation for myself before proceeding." The words were calm, but the meaning was clear. This wasn't a request. It was the beginning of something that would move forward whether they were ready or not. Ruth held his gaze, not backing down, not raising her voice either. "They're not a situation," she said. "They're children, and they've been through enough." Charles inclined his head again, acknowledging the statement without agreeing to it. "Which is precisely why they should be in an environment that can provide them with everything they need," he replied. "Stability, opportunity, security." His eyes moved briefly around the house again, taking in its age, its imperfections, the visible limits of what it could offer. Things that are difficult to guarantee here. Ruth felt the words land, not because they were entirely untrue, but because they reduced something immeasurable to something measurable. "They have stability," she said, her voice firming. "They have a home." Charles looked at her, really looked this time, and for a moment, something in his expression softened, not with agreement, but with recognition of her conviction. "We'll let the court decide that," he said. And just like that, the ground beneath everything they had built began to shift. The weeks that followed didn't move like time usually did in Pine Hollow. They dragged, stretched, bent under the weight of something none of them could stop. Every day marked not by routine, but by appointments, paperwork, and the slow, grinding realization that love, no matter how steady, was being measured against things it was never meant to compete with. Ruth had never spent much time in courtrooms before, never sat under fluorescent lights while strangers asked questions about her life as if it were a case study instead of a lived experience. But now she found herself there more often than in her own kitchen, her hands folded tightly in her lap, answering questions about income, square footage, long-term stability, things that could be written down and compared, things that didn't leave room for what happened in the quiet hours, in the moments no report could capture. Her lawyer, a young woman named Denise Carter, fresh out of law school and still learning how to hold her ground in rooms that weren't designed to listen, did what she could with what she had. She spoke about consistency, about the boys' improvement in school, about Micah's progress at the gym, about Noah speaking again, about Elijah no longer acting like he had to carry the world alone. She called Pastor Samuel, who spoke with a calm conviction about the change he had seen, about the way the boys had found something in Ruth's home that hadn't been present before. Lorraine came too, sitting in the witness chair with her hands clasped, her voice steady, as she described the night Ruth walked through the cold to save Noah. The kind of detail that made people shift in their seats, that made the story feel real instead of theoretical. And for a moment, it felt like it might be enough, like the truth might hold its own weight. But then Charles Whitmore's attorneys stood, their voices measured, precise, their arguments structured in a way that didn't need to be loud to be powerful. They spoke about resources, about long-term educational opportunities, about medical care, about the advantages of being raised within one's biological family, about legal precedents and the rights of next of kin. They didn't attack Ruth directly, didn't question her character, didn't dismiss her efforts. They simply placed them next to everything Charles could offer and let the comparison do the work. The judge listened to all of it, her expression neutral, her pen moving steadily across paper. And when she spoke, it wasn't with cruelty, it wasn't with indifference, it was with something far more difficult to argue against. A kind of careful reasoning that followed the law as it was written. She acknowledged Ruth's role, her care, her consistency, the clear bond that had formed. She said all the things that made it clear she saw what had been built. And then she said the rest, that the boys had a living biological relative with the means to provide for them in ways that extended beyond the immediate, that the law prioritized that connection when it was deemed safe and viable, that while this transition would be difficult, it was, in her judgment, in their long-term best interest. Ruth heard the words, every single one, but they didn't land all at once. They came in pieces, fragments that didn't quite fit together in her mind because nothing about them matched what she had lived. Elijah's hand tightened around the edge of the bench. Micah's breathing shifted, sharp and uneven. Noah went completely still, the kind of stillness that felt like retreat. Denise placed a hand gently on Ruth's arm, a small human gesture in a room that had suddenly become too formal, too distant. The decision was final. There would be no extension, no delay long enough to change the outcome. Arrangements would be made, the transition executed within the week. The house felt different the moment they returned, not because anything had physically changed, but because everything inside it had been given an end date. The porch lights still came on that evening, but it didn't feel like a habit anymore. It felt like something being held on to, something that might be taken away. Dinner was quieter than usual, the sounds of forks against plates too loud in the absence of conversation. Micah pushed his food around more than he ate. Elijah sat upright, his posture rigid, like if he let himself relax even a little, something would break open that he wouldn't be able to contain. Noah kept his notebook close, not writing, just holding it as if it were the only thing that hadn't shifted beneath him. "I'm not going," Micah said suddenly, his voice cutting through the silence, sharp and immediate. "They can't make me go." Ruth looked at him, her expression steady but soft. "I wish that were true," she said quietly. "Then make it true," he shot back, anger rising fast now, desperate, unfocused. You fought them, didn't you? Fight harder." The words weren't an accusation. Not really. They were a plea wrapped in frustration, in fear that didn't know where else to go. "I did fight," Ruth replied, her voice not rising to meet his, "and I'll keep fighting in every way I can. But there are things bigger than what I can change by myself." Micah pushed back from the table, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. "So that's it?" he demanded. "We just leave, like all the other places?" Elijah stood then, not to argue, but to step between the moment and whatever it might turn into. "Micah," he said, his tone low but firm. "Stop." Micah looked at him, eyes blazing. "You're just going to let this happen?" Elijah didn't answer right away. He didn't have one that would make it better. Noah spoke then, his voice quieter than both of theirs, but somehow cutting through more cleanly. "Will you still leave the light on?" he asked, looking at Ruth, not at his brothers, not at the table, just at her. The question landed differently than everything else had. Not about control, not about fighting, but about something simpler, something that had been built between them in the spaces where words weren't always needed. Ruth's throat tightened, but her answer didn't waver. "Every night," she said. "No matter what." Noah nodded once, as if that was the piece he needed to hold on to. The days leading up to their departure moved in a strange, suspended way, each moment both heavy and fleeting, like something slipping through your hands no matter how tightly you tried to hold it. Ruth didn't try to fill every second with meaning, didn't turn it into a series of speeches or forced memories. She cooked the same meals, sat in the same chair, kept the same routines, because that was what had made it real in the first place. Elijah spent more time near her, not always talking, sometimes just standing in the doorway or sitting at the table while she moved around the kitchen, as if proximity alone might anchor something that was being pulled away. Micah oscillated between anger and silence, moments of sharp resistance followed by stretches where he said nothing at all, his energy turned inward because there was nowhere else to put it. Noah wrote more in those days than he had before, page after page, his pencil moving steadily, like he was trying to capture something before it disappeared. The morning they left came without ceremony, the sky clear in a way that felt almost cruel, given everything else. The car arrived on time, not the distant observer from before, but something more official now, more final. Ruth stood on the porch again, the same place she had stood when they first arrived. But the feeling in her chest was entirely different, heavier, more fragile, in a way she hadn't known it could be. Elijah stepped forward first, his movements controlled, his expression tight but not breaking. He stopped in front of her, close enough that the distance between them felt like a choice instead of a barrier. "We don't want this," he said, his voice low, steady, carrying more restraint than his age should have required. "I know," Ruth replied, her own voice quiet but sure. "I know you don't." He looked at her then, really looked, the way he had that first day, but without the suspicion, without the need to assess. "I finally believed you," he said, the words simple but heavy, "that you'd stay." Ruth reached out then, placing her hand against his cheek, the gesture gentle but certain. "I did stay," she said, "and I will, even if it's not in the way we planned." He closed his eyes for a second, just long enough to feel it, then stepped forward, pulling her into a hug that was no longer cautious, no longer measured. When he pulled back, there was something in his expression that hadn't been there before. Not strength, not exactly, but something built from it. Micah came next, his steps faster, his control thinner. He wrapped his arms around her without hesitation, holding on tightly his shoulders shaking despite the way he tried to hide it. "This isn't fair," he muttered into her shoulder, the words muffled but clear. "No," Ruth said softly, her hand resting on the back of his head. "It isn't." She pulled back just enough to look at him, her eyes steady. "Listen to me," she said. "Don't let this turn you into something you're not. You hear me?" He shook his head at first, like he didn't want to accept anything that came with this moment, then nodded once, reluctantly, because it was her asking. Noah stood in front of her last, his notebook in his hands, the cover worn from years of being held too tightly. He didn't say anything at first. He just looked at her, his eyes searching her face as if committing it to memory. Then he held the notebook out. "Keep it," he said, "until I come back." Ruth hesitated for a fraction of a second, not because she didn't understand, but because she did. This wasn't just a notebook, it was a promise. She took it carefully, holding it against her chest. "I will," she said. "I won't open it. Not until you do." Noah nodded, the smallest shift in his expression, something like trust settling in a place that had been empty for a long time. Elijah turned back once more before getting into the car, his eyes finding hers across the space that had once been filled with certainty. "We'll find you," he said, his voice carrying something firm, something that didn't depend on the circumstances. "No matter how long it takes." Ruth nodded, not because she needed the promise, but because she believed him. "I'll be right here," she replied. The door closed. The engine started. The car pulled away slowly at first, then faster as it reached the end of the road, the distance growing in a way that felt immediate and endless at the same time. Ruth stood on the porch long after it was gone, the notebook still held tightly in her hands, the silence settling back into the space they had filled, but not in the same way as before. This silence carried memory, carried absence, carried something that refused to be erased. That night, when the sun went down and the sky darkened over Pine Hollow, Ruth stepped out onto the porch, just as she had every night since they arrived. She reached for the switch by the door, and it flickered once, then steadied, casting that same warm glow over the yard, over the road, over the place where they had stood just hours before. She didn't turn it off when she went back inside. She didn't turn it off the next night either, or the night after that. Years passed, not in a rush, but in a steady unfolding that reshaped everything around her, while leaving certain things untouched. 22 years ago, he began, his voice carrying clearly across the crowd, this town had a chance to make room for 3 boys. The words echoed the ones he had spoken before, but now they held context, history, truth. Most people looked the other way, he continued, not accusing, not softening it either. Some didn't know what to do. Some thought it wasn't their responsibility. That's how it goes sometimes. He paused, letting that settle, not rushing past it. But one person didn't, he said, turning slightly, his gaze finding Ruth. One person opened her door when she had every reason not to. She didn't have the money, she didn't have the resources, but she had something else, and it was enough. The crowd shifted, some faces lowering, others lifting, the weight of recognition moving through them in different ways. Micah stepped forward next, his voice carrying a different kind of strength, one built from everything he had fought through. "We're not here to make anyone feel guilty," he said. "We're here because we know what it looks like when someone shows up, and we know what it costs when nobody does." He glanced out at the people, his expression steady. "We're building something here, a place where families get support before they fall apart, where kids don't get separated just because it's easier on paper." where showing up actually means something. Noah stepped up last, his tone quieter but no less powerful. "Forgiveness isn't about pretending none of it happened," he said. "It's about deciding what happens next." He looked at Ruth, then back at the crowd. "She taught us that, not by saying it, by living it." There was a moment of silence after that, not empty, but full. The kind that comes when people are processing something they can't easily categorize. Then, from somewhere in the crowd, an older woman stepped forward, her movements slow but deliberate, her face lined with years and something else, something like regret. She stopped at the edge of the stage, looking up at Ruth. "I said things," she admitted, her voice trembling slightly. "Back then, about you, about those boys. Things I shouldn't have said." She swallowed, her eyes not leaving Ruth's. "I was wrong." Ruth looked at her for a long second, not rushing to respond, not brushing it off. Then she nodded once, her voice calm, grounded. "We all are sometimes," she said. "What matters is what we do after we know better." She stepped forward, closing the distance, not dramatically, just enough to meet the moment where it stood. The applause that followed wasn't explosive, it wasn't immediate, but it grew, steady, real, spreading through the crowd as something shifted in Pine Hollow, something that had been held in place for a long time, finally loosening its grip. Later that evening, as the sun dipped low once more, Ruth stood on her porch, the same porch that had held so many beginnings and endings. Elijah was next door, already making plans to stay close. Micah's laughter carried from the yard where he was talking with kids who had gathered. Noah sat at the table inside, going over documents that would turn plans into action. The house was no longer quiet, not in the way it had been before. Ruth reached for the switch by the door as the sky darkened, her fingers resting on it for a moment before she flipped it on. The porch light came to life, steady and warm, casting that familiar glow over the yard, over the road, over everything that had come and gone and come back again. She looked out at it, then back into the house, where voices filled the space once more. Somewhere in the distance, a car pulled up, slower this time, uncertain, and a small figure stepped out, a child holding a worn backpack, looking toward the house with the same hesitation Ruth had seen so many years ago. She didn't hesitate now. She stepped down from the porch, her voice gentle. "Sure." "Hey there," she said, kneeling just enough to meet the girl's eyes. "Come on in, there's room." And just like that, the light stayed on. She heard it, all of it, in passing conversations, in the way voices dropped when she entered a room, in the glances that lingered just a little too long. She didn't argue. She didn't defend herself to every person who didn't know the truth. She kept moving, kept working where she could, cleaning houses, taking on odd jobs, stretching what little she had to keep the place standing. The house aged with her, the repairs that had once felt manageable becoming harder to keep up with. The work she relied on shifting, then disappearing altogether when budgets changed and positions were cut. People in town talked, quietly at first, then with more certainty, stories forming to fill the gaps they didn't understand. Some said the boys had been better off leaving, that a place like that had never been meant to hold them. Others questioned Ruth's intentions, the way people sometimes do when kindness doesn't fit neatly into their expectations. When she got sick, truly sick, the kind of diagnosis that changes everything in a single sentence, she faced it the same way she had faced everything else, one day at a time, leaning on Lorraine when she had to, letting Pastor Samuel sit with her in the quiet when the nights got too long. Through all of it, the porch lights stayed on. She never opened the notebook, not once. It sat on the mantel above the fireplace, just beneath the carved words she had read so many times before. A constant presence, a promise waiting to be kept. She only knew what she had given, what they had shared, and what she had promised. And every night, as the sun dipped below the trees and the sky darkened over Pine Hollow, Ruth Ellen Carter stepped onto her porch, reached for the switch, and kept the light on. Time has a way of moving quietly until it doesn't, until it gathers everything you thought was settled and brings it back to your doorstep all at once. And for Ruth Ellen Carter, that moment came on a morning that started like so many others, slow, deliberate, shaped by habit more than expectation. Some nights, when the house felt especially quiet, she would stand in front of it, her fingers brushing the edge of the cover, not opening it, just reminding herself it was still there, that something of them remained within reach. She tried to find them, at first, writing letters to the address she had been given, calling numbers that no longer worked, following leads that went nowhere. Eventually, the trail went cold, not because she stopped caring, but because there was nothing left to follow. She didn't know where they had gone, how they were doing, what they had become. The house was older now, the paint more worn, the repairs harder to keep up with, but it was still standing, still holding everything it had ever held, and Ruth moved through it with the same steady rhythm she always had, even as her body reminded her more often of the years that had passed. The porch light had been turned off at dawn, like always, not because it wasn't needed, but because she trusted it would be there again when night came. The same quiet promise she had kept for more than 2 decades. She was in the garden that morning, hands deep in the soil, tending to the plants that had outlasted so much, when she heard it. Not one engine, but several. The sound unfamiliar in its smoothness, its weight, something that didn't belong to Pine Hollow. She straightened slowly, brushing the dirt from her hands, her eyes lifting toward the road, and for a second, just a second, something in her chest tightened, in a way she hadn't felt in years. Not quite hope, not quite fear, but something close to both. The first SUV appeared at the bend, black and polished, followed by 2 more, moving in quiet formation, deliberate, unhurried, like they knew exactly where they were going. Neighbors noticed too, doors opening, curtains shifting, the same quiet curiosity spreading through the town that had once whispered about her, about the boys, about everything they didn't understand. The vehicles pulled up in front of her house, gravel crunching under their tires, engines cutting off one by one, leaving a silence that felt heavier than the noise that had come before it. Ruth stood there, one hand still resting against the edge of the garden bed, her breath caught somewhere between past and present, not moving forward, not stepping back, just waiting. The first door opened, and a man stepped out, tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a way that spoke of a life far removed from this place, but there was something in the way he moved, something in the way his eyes searched, that didn't belong to that distance. Ruth's heart stuttered, her mind trying to reconcile what she was seeing with what she had carried for so long. Then the third man, the one who had stepped out last, took a few steps forward, his voice breaking the silence in a way that felt both new and familiar. "You kept the light on," he said, and just like that, the distance collapsed. Ruth's hand went to her chest, her breath catching fully now, her eyes searching his face, tracing the lines time had added, but finding what had never changed beneath them. "Noah," she whispered, the name leaving her lips before she could stop it, before she could question it, because she didn't need to. He smiled then, small at first, then wider, something of that quiet boy still present, in the man he had become. "Hey, Mama Ruth," he said softly. The world didn't rush forward after that. It broke open. Ruth moved before she realized she had, her steps faster than they had been in years, her body remembering something her mind hadn't dared to expect. Elijah reached her first, just as he had all those years ago, in different ways, his arms wrapping around her with a certainty that carried everything he had once held back. The second man followed, leaner, his posture precise, controlled, a quiet intensity in the way he took in everything around him. And then the third stepped out, slower, adjusting his glasses as he looked toward the porch, toward the door, toward her. For a moment, none of them spoke. The years between them stood there, visible and invisible all at once, layered over the space that had once held something so simple and so fragile. "We found you," he said, his voice thick, steadier than his eyes, which no longer hid what they felt. Micah was there a second later, pulling both of them closer, his strength no longer sharp with anger, but anchored in something deeper, something built over time instead of against it. Noah stepped in last, completing the circle, and for a moment, for a long moment, none of them let go. They stood like that in the yard, 4 people held together by something that had refused to break, even when everything else had tried to pull it apart. Around them, Pine Hollow watched, the same town that had once whispered now, standing in silence, witnessing something they didn't fully understand but couldn't look away from. Inside the house, the years folded in on themselves, the space both familiar and changed. The furniture worn but intact, the walls holding echoes of voices that had once filled them. Elijah moved through it slowly, his hand brushing against the back of the chair where he had once sat, his eyes taking in the details as if confirming they were real. "You didn't change it," he said quietly. Ruth shook her head. "Didn't feel right to," she replied. Micah stood near the doorway to the hallway, glancing toward the rooms that had once been his, something unreadable passing through his expression, before settling into something softer. Noah moved directly to the mantel, his eyes locking onto the object that had never left its place. The notebook. It sat exactly where Ruth had kept it all those years, the cover worn but intact, the edges softened by time. He reached for it slowly, his fingers hesitating just before touching it, like the moment itself required care. "You really didn't open it," he said, more to himself than to her. Ruth stepped closer, her voice quiet. "I promised," she said simply. Noah nodded, his hand finally closing around it, lifting it with a kind of reverence that made the room feel still again. He opened it there, right in the living room, the pages turning beneath his fingers, the words of his younger self filling the space between them, stories written in a time when he hadn't known what would come next. He paused at the last page, his brow furrowing slightly, something catching his attention, something new. They sat together after that, not rushing to explain everything all at once, letting the conversation come in pieces, in stories that filled the years between them. Elijah spoke about the search, about the investigators, about the dead ends and the near misses, about how long it had taken to find her again. Micah talked less, but when he did, it was with a clarity that hadn't been there before, about the anger he had carried, about the way it had almost consumed him before he learned how to shape it into something else. Ruth watched his face, the way it changed as he read, the way the boy she had known surfaced in the man he had become. She wrote it before. Noah didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. Ruth placed a hand gently on his arm. "I figured you'd find it when you were ready," she said. Noah looked at her then, something deeper than gratitude in his expression, something that reached all the way back to the moment he had handed her that notebook on the porch. "You kept more than the light on," he said. Tucked between the pages was a folded piece of paper, aged but preserved, the edges delicate. His breath caught as he unfolded it, his eyes moving quickly at first, then slowing, the words settling in. "What is it?" Micah asked, stepping closer. Noah didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was quieter than any of them had heard in years. "It's from her," he said. "From Mum." The room shifted again, the presence of someone no longer there, suddenly filling the space in a different way. Noah spoke about the law, about the work he had chosen, about making sure no child would be separated the way they had been, without someone fighting harder for them. "And you?" Ruth asked quietly, her eyes moving between them. Elijah leaned back slightly, a small smile forming. "We built something," he said. "Not just for us, for people like us." Micah nodded. "We didn't forget," he added. Noah met her gaze directly. "We couldn't," he said. The conversation shifted then, gently, toward the present, toward the reason they had come, not just to see her, but to change something that had been left undone. "We know about the house," Elijah said, his tone careful, respectful of the space they were in. Ruth's expression tightened slightly, just for a moment. "It's nothing I can't handle," she replied, the same quiet pride she had always carried surfacing instinctively. Micah knelt beside her chair, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "You don't have to handle it alone anymore," he said. Noah reached into his bag, pulling out a set of documents, placing them gently on the table. "The mortgage is paid," he said. "Completely. The house is yours. No liens, no debt." Ruth blinked, the words taking a second to settle, to find their place in a reality that had been shaped by making do for so long. "You didn't have to," she began, but Elijah shook his head. "We did," he said simply. "And that's not all," Noah continued, his voice steady now, the lawyer in him blending seamlessly with the boy she had known. "We're starting a foundation, here, in Pine Hollow." Ruth looked at him, confusion and curiosity mixing. "A foundation," she repeated. Micah nodded. "For foster families," he said. "For kids who get passed around like we did. For people who want to help but don't have the support." Elijah leaned forward slightly. "We're calling it the Carter Light Foundation," he added, "and we want you to run it, if you're willing." The words hung in the air, larger than anything Ruth had expected, larger than anything she had allowed herself to imagine. "I don't," she started, then stopped, the scale of it pressing against everything she knew about herself. "I'm not qualified for something like that." Noah smiled gently. "You already did it," he said. "We're just giving you the tools to do it for more people." By that afternoon, the news had spread across Pine Hollow, not in whispers this time, but in something closer to disbelief, curiosity drawing people toward the town square once again, the same place where the story had begun that morning. Cameras were set up, microphones adjusted, the crowd larger now, fuller, the weight of attention settling over the space. Ruth stood beside Elijah, Micah, and Noah, her hands steadier than they had been earlier. Not because the moment was smaller, but because she understood it now. Elijah stepped forward first, his presence commanding without needing to force it.